I trained my replacement for 6 months without knowing it. I want to tell you about the day I figured it out. Not the day they told me, because they didn't tell me. Not a conversation, not a memo, not a meeting where someone sat across from me and had the basic professional decency to say what was happening. None of that. I figured it out myself. On a Tuesday morning in February, in the middle of what I thought was a routine project handover meeting, when Lauren, the woman I had been training for 6 months, the woman I had genuinely liked, the woman I had given access to every system, every client, every process I had spent 4 years building, answered a question from our director about Q2 planning with information she could only have known if she had already been told she was staying permanently in my role. I felt the realization move through me the way cold water moves, fast, total, impossible to stop once it starts. I looked at Lauren. She was looking at her hands. And I understood in that moment that I was the only person in the room who had not known. I picked up my pen. I wrote something in the margin of my notepad. I kept my face completely still. What I wrote was, "Find out everything." That note became the beginning of the most important professional investigation I have ever conducted. And what I found and what I did with it is what I'm going to tell you today. Here is what 6 months of unknowing looks like from the inside. You show someone how the client management system works because you want them to be effective. You introduce them to your best contacts because generosity is a professional value you believe in. You walk them through your process documentation because institutional knowledge shouldn't live in one person's head. You do all of this because you are good at your job and because helping someone get up to speed is part of being good at your job. And then one Tuesday morning in February, you realize that every single thing you did in good faith was used deliberately with full organizational knowledge to make you replaceable. Stay with me. Because what I found out about who knew and when, what I documented, and what I ultimately did with all of it is a story about what happens when an organization bets that you won't figure it out until it's too late. They lost that bet. I had been at Callaway, I'll use that name for the company, for 4 years and 3 months when Lauren arrived. 4 years is long enough to become the person everyone goes to. Long enough to have built the kind of institutional knowledge that lives in your hands as much as your head. The client whose assistant you always copy on emails because she is the real decision maker. The vendor whose contract has a quirk in Section 4B that everyone forgets and that costs you leverage if you miss it. The internal process that the manual says works one way and that everyone who has been there longer than a year knows actually works another way entirely. I was that person. I had earned it deliberately, not by protecting information, but by accumulating it and being generous with it, which in most organizations is the fastest way to become indispensable. My role was Senior Client Operations Manager. 4 direct reports. A client portfolio worth approximately $8 million annually. A clean performance record. No formal complaints, consistent reviews, the kind of feedback that uses words like reliable and trusted and institutional backbone. I loved the work. I want to say that plainly. Not every part of it, not every day, but the fundamental satisfaction of managing something complex and making it run well, I loved that. In August, she was brought in, according to the announcement, as a senior operations specialist, a new position, the org chart said, to support expanding client operations as the company grew. I was asked to lead her onboarding. I said yes, without hesitation. Lauren was good. That is the part that still sits with me in a complicated way. She was genuinely competent, a fast learner, and someone I found myself actually enjoying working with, which made what I eventually understood about her role here not easier to process, but harder. She was 31. She had come from a competitor, smaller firm, different market segment, but adjacent enough that she had real industry knowledge and didn't need the foundational explanations that some new hires require. She asked good questions. She retained information quickly. She was professional without being stiff and warm without being performative. By week 3, I had told my manager that she was the best onboarding experience I had managed in 4 years. He said, "I'm glad to hear that." He said it with a particular flatness that I registered briefly and then filed away under "he's having a busy week" and moved on. I should not have filed it away. I should have sat with that flatness and asked it what it meant. Let me walk you through what 6 months looked like, because the details matter and because I want you to be able to recognize them if they ever happen to you. I gave Lauren access to everything. Client management platform, internal reporting tools, the project tracking system my team had built over 2 years to replace the inadequate one the company provided, the vendor portal, the client communication archives going back 3 years. I did this because it was my job. Because an operations specialist who doesn't have system access can't do anything useful. Because siloing information is how organizations calcify, and I had never believed in it. Every login I created for her, every permission level I set, every training session I ran on how the systems worked and why we'd made the choices we'd made. All of it, in retrospect, was a handover document I was writing without knowing I was writing it. I introduced Lauren to clients. Not all of them immediately. I was thoughtful about it, the way you are when you're bringing someone new into established relationships. I contextualized each introduction, explained the history, the preferences, the communication style, the specific sensitivities of each account. I brought her to 2 client review meetings in month 2. In both, I positioned her as a key member of our operations team, someone they would be working with closely. The clients responded well. One of them, a longtime contact I had a genuinely warm relationship with, told me afterward that Lauren seemed excellent. I was proud of that. I told my manager. He said, "Good. That's what we need." I thought he meant what I thought he meant. He didn't. This is the month I am most careful about when I tell the story because what happened in month 3 is the part that, in retrospect, was the most deliberate from the organizational side. Every workflow in our department, every decision tree, every exception protocol, every client-specific note that wasn't captured in the formal system. He framed it as operational resilience, reducing key person dependency, building institutional knowledge that would survive staff transitions. I thought he meant generally. A good practice. Responsible management. I spent 3 weeks building the most thorough process documentation I had ever produced. Lauren contributed, asked clarifying questions, learned the reasoning behind every decision point. At the end of month 3, our department had a documentation library that could, theoretically, allow someone to step into my role with significantly reduced ramp-up time. I submitted it to my manager with a cover note saying I was proud of how comprehensive it was. In month 4, something shifted. Small things, the kind of things that don't mean anything individually, but that, when you line them up later, tell a very clear story. I noticed them at the time. I explained them away, and the explaining away is the thing I have thought about most in the time since. The first signal, Lauren began receiving meeting invitations that I was not copied on. Leadership meetings. Quarterly planning sessions. Once, and I noticed this and asked my manager about it, a client strategy meeting for an account I managed directly. My manager said it was a bandwidth decision. He was trying to develop Lauren's exposure. Completely standard. I accepted this. The second signal, my manager began routing certain client questions directly to Lauren rather than to me. Small things initially, logistical queries, scheduling questions. Then slightly larger things. Then, in month 5, a client called me directly because they had emailed Lauren and not heard back, and Lauren's email signature now listed her title as Senior Client Operations Manager. My title. I mentioned this to my manager. He said it was a system error. He would get it corrected. It was not corrected. The third signal, and this is the one I should have acted on immediately and did not. In month 5, my manager asked me in our one-on-one whether I had ever considered what I might want to do next, whether I had thought about other opportunities, internally or externally, whether I felt I had room to grow in my current role. I said I was very satisfied in my current role and was focused on the Q4 client cycle. He nodded and changed the subject. What he was actually doing, I understand now, was opening a door I could have walked through to have a very different conversation. He was, in the particular language of managers who are not willing to be direct, giving me an opportunity to raise my hand before the decision became final. I didn't know there was a decision to raise my hand about. So I talked about Q4 instead. The Q2 planning meeting was on a Tuesday in February. Lauren 2 seats to my left. Standard agenda, quarterly goals, resource allocation, client pipeline review. I had prepared thoroughly. I had notes, projections, a client retention analysis I had spent the previous week building. I was ready to contribute substantively. The meeting ran normally for the first 20 minutes. Then my manager asked Lauren directly, by name, what her approach would be to the Hargrove account renewal in Q2. The Hargrove account was mine. I had managed it for 3 years. The renewal was a conversation I had been planning for 6 weeks. Lauren answered, confidently, with specifics, timeline, strategy, the particular relationship dynamic with the Hargrove procurement lead that I had explained to her in detail during month 2 of her onboarding. She answered as though the account was already hers to answer for. My manager nodded, made a note, moved on. He did not look at me. I felt the cold water move through me. I looked at Lauren. She was looking at her hands, the specific way people look at their hands when they know something they wish they didn't have to know. I looked at my manager. He was looking at his notes. I picked up my pen. I wrote in the margin of my notepad, find out everything. I did not say a word for the remaining 40 minutes of the meeting. I contributed when directly addressed. I kept my face completely still. I answered questions about my own accounts with the same tone I always used. What I found in the next 72 hours was worse than I had prepared myself for. Not because the facts were surprising. By that point, I had already assembled most of them in my head during that 40-minute meeting. But because of the timeline, because of how long this had been decided, and because of one email I was never supposed to see. 72 hours. That is how long it took me to know everything I needed to know. The email I was never supposed to see came from a forwarding error, the organizational kind, where someone hits reply all on a thread and includes a recipient who is not meant to be there. It had arrived 3 weeks earlier. I had opened it, registered that it didn't seem relevant to me, and archived it without reading past the first line. This is what we do with misdirected emails. We don't read them. We archive them. On Tuesday afternoon, I went back and read it. It was a thread between my manager and 2 HR representatives. Subject line, Callaway, Operations Transition Plan, Confidential. The thread was 8 exchanges long. The earliest message in the chain was dated 6 weeks before Lauren arrived. 6 weeks before Lauren arrived, my manager and HR had been discussing the transition plan for my role. Lauren had been identified as the replacement candidate. The onboarding structure, the systems access, the client introductions, the process documentation project had been designed as a knowledge transfer framework. All of it designed before she arrived. I had not been told. I had not been consulted. I had not been given the conversation my manager had tried, obliquely, to open in month 5. I had been managed out, carefully, professionally, with a 6-month runway that I had spent building my own replacement because nobody had the decency to tell me that's what I was doing. I read the email chain 3 times. Then I forwarded it to my personal email address. Then I printed it. Then I called an employment attorney. The call lasted 45 minutes. I laid out the timeline, the email, the process documentation project, the title discrepancy in Lauren's email signature that had never been corrected, and the pattern of meeting exclusions in months 4 and 5. The attorney said 2 things that mattered. First, the email chain, combined with the structured onboarding I had been asked to lead, potentially constituted a failure to provide adequate notice under my employment agreement, which had a specific clause about role elimination timelines. She wanted to review my contract. Second, the way the transition had been managed, including the process documentation project framed as operational resilience rather than role succession, raised potential questions about good faith dealing. Whether that was actionable depended on specifics. But it was worth a formal review. I emailed her my employment contract that evening. While the attorney reviewed my contract, I built a timeline. Every client introduction, every training session, every system permission I had created, every piece of process documentation I had produced, every meeting I had been excluded from, the email chain, the title discrepancy, the month 5 conversation about what I might want to do next. 43 days of documented transition activity, all framed internally as onboarding and operational development, all functioning, as the email chain confirmed, as a structured replacement process. I organized it chronologically. I attached supporting documentation to each entry. I sent the full package to my attorney. She called me the next morning and said, "Your contract has a 90-day notice provision for role elimination. Based on this timeline, you are approximately 6 months into an undisclosed transition. I think we have something to work with." I had two options at this point. I could confront my manager, walk into his office with the email chain and the timeline and the attorney's assessment, and watch the conversation that followed. Or I could do something more considered, something that would produce a better outcome and cost them more than a conversation would. I chose the second option, and it started with a meeting request I sent to HR. I requested a meeting with HR, not my manager. HR, the same two representatives who appeared in the email chain I had never been meant to see. I did not tell them what the meeting was about. I said I wanted to discuss my role and career development. Standard language. Nothing that would trigger a defensive response before I was in the room. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday. I spent Wednesday evening with my attorney going through exactly what I would say and what I would not say. She had reviewed my contract, assessed the timeline, and given me a precise picture of what I was entitled to request and what leverage I had to request it. I walked into that HR meeting with a printed copy of my employment contract, my documented timeline, and one question written at the top of my notepad. "What is Callaway's plan for my role?" I asked it in the first 3 minutes. The HR representatives looked at each other with the particular look of people who had not expected the conversation to go here this quickly. The senior one said, "We've been meaning to schedule time to discuss some organizational changes." I said, "I'd like to discuss them now. I'm aware of the transition plan. I have been since Tuesday." A longer silence. I placed the timeline on the table. Not the email, not yet. Just the timeline. 43 days of documented transition activity, organized and annotated. I said, "I want to have a direct conversation about my severance, my notice period under my employment agreement, and the terms of my departure. I have legal counsel reviewing my contract. I'd prefer to resolve this between us rather than through that process, and I think that preference is mutual." The senior HR representative looked at the timeline for a long moment. Then she said, "I think we should loop in legal." I said, "Of course. I'll have my attorney available by phone." The negotiation took 11 days. My attorney, at the close of the negotiation, said something I have thought about often. She said, "Most people in your situation don't find the email. And the ones who find it don't know what to do with it. You did both." I said, "I had good help." She said, "You came to me with a 43-point timeline organized by date with supporting documentation attached. The help was a phone call." Lauren, as far as I know, is still in the role. I don't hold that against her. She was placed in an uncomfortable position by an organization that managed both of us poorly, and she handled it, from what I observed, with as much decency as the situation allowed. My manager left Callaway 8 months after I did. Voluntarily, his LinkedIn said. I have no information beyond that. Here is what I want you to take from this. The things that matter regardless of whether this has happened to you or whether it ever does. First, your employment contract is not a document you sign and forget. It is a set of rights. Know what they are. Know the notice provisions, the role elimination clauses, the severance terms. Read it the way someone might one day use it against you or for you. Second, misdirected emails are not your fault and not your responsibility to ignore. If information reaches you through a legitimate channel, even accidentally, you are entitled to know it. Act on what you know. Third, when something feels wrong at work, the routing changes, the meeting exclusions, the slightly odd tone in a one-on-one, write it down. Date it. You may never need it, but if you do, having it organized is the difference between a conversation and a negotiation. Fourth, HR is not your advocate. HR manages organizational risk. Know the difference and act accordingly, which means bringing your own clarity, your own documentation, and if the stakes are high enough, your own counsel. Fifth, the most powerful thing you can do when you find out something that should have been told to you directly is to remain completely composed and get very organized very quickly. Panic is information leaking out. Organization is power building up. I spent 6 months teaching Lauren everything I knew. I don't regret a single lesson. Because every skill I taught her, I still have. Every client relationship I built, I took with me, not the accounts, but the knowledge of how to build them. Every process I documented, I understand better for having documented it. They tried to empty me out. What they found was that the thing they were trying to take couldn't be transferred. It just made me better at the next place I took it. If you have ever had a moment at work where something small made you go quiet and start paying very close attention, drop a comments. Tell me what it was. I want to read every single one. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed it, subscribe. Every week, another story. Some of them will make you check your employment contract tonight. Some of them will make you start a document you hope you never need. All of them will make you harder to catch off guard. Next week, a woman finds out her business partner has been taking credit for her work with every shared client for 7 years. What she builds to prove it, and what she does with that proof, is the most methodical thing I have told you yet. See you then.